Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Good morning on the West Coast. Why are you not asleep if you're in Australia? This is Parsha Talk a little bit early, Tuesday evening here in Israel. This week's Parsha is Parshat Vayechi. I'm Avi Grossman. With us is Rabbi Shalom, the man who, to whom I have to give credit for first bringing me to Israel to study. And apparently, thank God, it hasn't come to an end yet. So I'm very thankful for that. Rabbi Hammer is a senior lecturer for the IDF. He also has a few of his own personal projects. Go check out rabbihammer.com. That's RABBIHAMMER.com. And Makom Shutaf. That's the specific one. Stay with me. It's MAKOMMESHUTAF.com. We'll put that in the description also, makomishutaf.com. And check out Rabbi Hammer's website. He has a few books there also that I have I quite enjoyed myself, and even some that I had the privilege of helping with way back when. And we wanted to start tonight. Rabbi Hammer, tell us, what is Makom Shutaf exactly?
Makom Shutaf is basically a response. We started it about 9 years ago. I should mention that it's now under the auspices officially of the World Mizrahi Movement, Mizrahi Olami. Mizrahi Olami run all of their programming is run really in the diaspora. I guess a feather in our cap is that we are the only programming that Mizrahi Olami has in Israel. And what I saw was that essentially many of these secular Israelis here in Eretz Israel see Judaism as being marketed, as being coercive, and they're uncomfortable with what Judaism has to offer. And so what I sought out to do was basically to reach predominantly a secular Israeli audience. I ventured first into kibbutzim, moshavim, yishuvim, settlements, and smaller venues so that I could offer kind of like a familial or homey atmosphere and offer them a Judaism that they could be proud of. Without any context of being shomer mitzvot, keeping the mitzvot. Not that I'm against that, obviously. It'd be wonderful if all of them would be, but certainly not coming from me, but more a Judaism that they should be proud of in terms of what they share in common with the rest of the Jewish people, i.e. a Torah, the historical aspect of the Jewish people, the cultural aspect, Havanat Bikra, understanding the context of the various interpretations of the Torah itself, which is obviously so rich in material and so rich in knowledge and understanding, and use those venues as a means of uniting and bonding with one another. And I have always said, and I always explain to Israelis as well, and to other Jews as well, that when one goes into marketing, and I'm not a businessman myself, but my understanding of marketing is that when one goes into marketing, if they are comfortable or secure enough with their product, then they give off at least the air that the product can sell itself. Whereas when one is not as secure with what they have to offer, then they feel that they have to be coercive and deceitful. And unfortunately, there are segments of Israeli population who have that or have gathered that impression, be it justified or not, and I think a little bit of both, from the Israeli rabbinate and from the way things are run in terms of monopolizing Judaism, certainly religious observance. And I thought that that was unfortunate. And as I explained, I want Judaism to sell itself. I believe it's good enough product, certainly has proven itself for over 3,000 years. And therefore, that's what I try to offer all Israelis in all venues that I sought after. That's Makom Meshutaf.
So that's basically outreach to Israelis. So I figure most of your lectures in that circuit are in Hebrew, right?
It's all in Hebrew. You use the word outreach in English, which is kind of, I guess, an accepted term. But here in Israel, the word kiruv, which is translated from outreach, kiruv is actually from karov, which would be more in reach. Yeah. But kiruv is a taboo. particularly to secular Israelis. It implies that we're trying to get them to grow peyot, to put on talit and tefillin, and it's a fairly dangerous word in that world. So I avoid that word at all costs. It's not what I'm trying to do anyway. But we call it hitchabrut, milashon chaver, to be friends, to be united, to be understanding to one another. And by the way, it's not all one-sided. It has to come from both sides as well. One of the programs that I have is called Eretz Nehederet, from Makom Meshutaf, a beautiful land, in which we have a panel discussion, myself being representative of the Dati Leumi Mizrahi movement. I then have a Haredi woman from the Gila in Yerushalayim. She's phenomenal. And a guy named Dubi Barak, who's a secular Israeli, very, very bright, very well learned. And we all three sit on a panel and discuss our differences in front of the kibbutz, or in front of the audience, as it were. And it gives them an opportunity to be exposed, and also to be exposed to the fact that we're willing to sit together and discuss, regardless of the fact that we don't see eye to eye on all of the issues.
All right. You just reminded me, there's another organization out there, so I'm not going to call them Outreach or Kiruv. They're mostly Sephardic and, I guess, Haredi, the Hidabrut organization. Hidabrut also. That means we're being in conversation with each other. But it doesn't imply that we're trying to missionize or trying to change anybody necessarily. Tell me.
I mean, you'll have to speak to them to ask them what their venue is.
Okay. Well, at least I've actually been to a few of their events. Ironically, they even come here to Kochav Yaakov, which last I checked is a mostly Dati, if not even Haredi community. So you'd think that this isn't the place that they would be looking for, but apparently they do come here. I haven't yet to see anything from a Makom Meshutaf, but perhaps in the future. Tell me, what surprising places have you been? And what have you seen happen from that? Have you been to anywhere?
Are you talking about within the parameters of Makom Meshutaf?
Yes. Have you been to, let's say, I don't know, very militantly secular places in Tel Aviv? I'm thinking Yair Lapid or Tamar Zandberg territory. Perhaps
I wouldn't throw out names, but I'll tell you, last week, again, like I said, I try to gravitate to the kibbutzim, the moshavim, the yeshuvim. I don't go to cities very much. It's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for places that are insular by nature, so that we can nurture a relationship and so that there's an understanding. Last week, I was in kibbutz Ein Gedi, which is a completely secular kibbutz. It's the fifth time I've been there. I have a very good relationship and rapport with a guy named Meni Gal, who has what you would call smicha to be a Chiloni rabbi. He does not believe in Torah min hashamayim. He doesn't believe that the Torah is from the heavens. I'm not even sure if he believes in God, but you should know that there is what they call a Chiloni smicha, a secular smicha ordination. It's kind of like a humanistic approach to Judaism. And actually, when you engage in dialogue with many of these guys, which I have, you realize that they're bigger believers than they themselves would have themselves know, ironically. But I give shiurim over there, classes, lectures, and I want to tell you something. They're very, very welcoming, very open, and very dignified and ready and prepared to hear what I have to say and to argue with it as well. But it's a phenomenal dialogue that we engage in. So we're talking about a group of like 20 people who are, as far as I know, all secular. They're not all virally anti-religion, but some of them certainly come from, when they read the Torah's text, they come from a historical aspect. And from a geographical or topographical aspect, as opposed to a spiritual or a revelation one. And it's very interesting, very fascinating. I give over my ideas, obviously, as I see them as an Orthodox rabbi, but it's a very respectful venue, and I believe it creates conversation, understanding, which in Israeli society is still extremely necessary and needed.
I am very surprised also you said that this is a Mizrahi run program. Mizrahi, when I think of Mizrahi, I think of I wouldn't say outreach, but I think about going to the diaspora and encouraging awareness or fostering awareness of issues regarding, let's say, the significance of the state of Israel and all that other stuff. How is it that Mizrahi got involved in this?
all that other stuff,
Yeah.
all that other stuff is one of the things that you opened up with, how you ended up here. So that other stuff is big stuff.
I owed a big. Where would we be without Mizrahi and all that? I think that it's very important. Also, I've seen their list of lecturers are all people I admire. As a matter of fact, some are recurring guests here. How is it that this became part of Mizrahi?
Well, that's interesting. I myself am very friendly with Rabbi Doron Perez, Rabbi Lawrence Perez, who's the head of Mizrahi Olami, or became the head a few years ago. We've always had very, very good relationship and rapport. And when he saw what we do, although the primary focus of Mizrahi is Zionism and Torat Eretz Yisrael, I don't think that there's any denial that what I'm doing is Torat Eretz Yisrael. It might be to a different clientele that Mizrahi might be used to. But so what? When in the end of the day, when you're spreading the message of Torah, of Eretz Yisrael, of healthy living, united living, of having common bonds and sharing ideas together in Israel, that's what makes for a healthier Israel. And Mizrahi certainly is in line with whatever it is that will make that happen.
Do you, not reach out, do you engage with the youth also in this regard? Or is it perhaps a more adult?
You can use the word engage. I do. I have all kinds of programs. So I have little kids programs. In fact, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to create a model of what was the classic Talmud Torah in the United States, a Sunday school for Reform temples, conservative synagogues, people who are not as affiliated or not as familiar with texts and so on and so forth. Their kids would go to public schools, completely unaffiliated, and to create a model where their kids could become familiar, at least, with the Judaism that they should be proud of, that they should be familiar with. And I don't see why that model doesn't exist here in Eretz Yisrael. Actually, I do see why. One of the reasons why, again, is because Judaism has been portrayed as being coercive, and there's this fear to engage into those or to venture into those various paths and avenues. And so one of the things that I do offer is a chug, almost like a chug Talmud Torah, a chug an Yahadut for little kids. We're talking about Kita Aleph. I sometimes engage with Kita Aleph through Kitot Vav, first through sixth graders, and certainly teen programs. And one of the largest areas that we get to are the secular pre-military academies. So we're talking about basically post-adolescence, pre-military, before they go into the army.
Mm-hmm. I was just reminded, my only experience with the conservative style Sunday school or Hebrew school that they used to have in America was seeing that before my elementary school had its own building, they were housed in a school-like building that was owned by a conservative synagogue, and they had Hebrew school after hours, after the public school hours. And I remember that I got to see some of their classes, and I saw that the level was so low, and their teacher, for kids my age, this is basically in sixth grade or so, their teacher was my former, a word I finally learned when I came to Israel, ganenet. She had been the nursery school teacher for me. So basically what she was teaching the religious kids in nursery, you know, what Shabbos is and a little bit of Hebrew. She only spoke to us in Hebrew, thank God. So I guess that helped me. This is basically what sixth graders and even some junior high schoolers were learning in Hebrew school after hours. I think that perhaps the Israelis already have an advantage, being that they already read Hebrew. They know what Tanakh is. They could probably get by reading, as long as it's not in Rashi letters. They could even understand what Rashi's saying. Have you noticed that they already have that foundation?
They certainly have the foundation of reading and knowing how to speak and to read Hebrew. As far as knowing Tanakh, Not necessarily.
Really?
I think you'd probably be hard pressed to go into many of the yeshivot here in Eretz Israel and to see whether or not they're familiar with Tanakh, including myself, by the way.
Oh,
So, as far as familiarizing ourselves with Tanakh, with what it says, with the words, the power of the words and the verse, that certainly needs to still be appreciated. And again, like I said, it's not an issue of not being familiar. It's an issue of what type of venue do they become familiar with it. In other words, through that venue, how they become familiar with it. So what I'm trying to do is not necessarily to recreate the wheel. The study or the understanding or appreciation of the stories in Tanakh might be there, but I'm trying to give them a healthy and positive perspective of those stories. I've come in contact with many high schoolers who are secular Israelis here in Eretz Israel, and they've told me after I've taught them various texts in pre-military academies that the way they learned it in their secular schools, public school, from their atheist teacher, for example, was completely different, and they never understood it that way. And they are wondering, why were we never exposed to understanding or seeing it in a healthy or positive way, as opposed to the ballistic or misaligned interpretation of what might be someone else. So, yeah, I mean, it's important for them to have exposure to different perspectives.
I was trying to tell someone also a few weeks ago who was just starting to be exposed to the Jewish study, traditional Jewish study of the Bible, and I was telling him you could study it academically, perhaps, and if you're an adult, perhaps you should even be exposed to certain academic study. But more importantly, you should be studying Tanakh through the eyes of the people who were the writers and the original readers, or Chazal at least understand how they understood their Tanakh, not the modern, I guess, the professorial way of understanding, which is still perhaps important, but you should at least know how we traditionally understand it and how they did it. Before I go on to the next topic, I want to ask you, do you have any Shabbos programs like Shabbatonim?
So that's a very interesting question. It's something that I still dream of to this day. I very much want to have a Shabbaton or a Shabbat on the kibbutz. The closest, we've never been able to do so. I think even with relationships and rapport that I've created with various kibbutzim, they're still a little standoffish when it comes to, because, and one of the reasons it's interesting, it's not because they're opposed to it, it's because they don't really know what it is. In other words, our concept of a Shabbat table or of singing or having an Onik Shabbat or discussions and going to Beit Knesset and then coming back and having a nice meal together, many of them are not familiar with that in a learning setting. So they might have a Friday night dinner or a Shabbat meal where they light the candles and then they sit around and, watch TV or talk or schmooze or whatever it is. But within a formal program, because really our Shabbat program, our Shabbat table, our Orthodox Shabbat table many times becomes almost like a formal program, because we have kind of the ceremonies that we go through and the various both restrictions and also positive experiences, and they're not that familiar with it. So they don't really envision how that would work. And even when you try to explain it to them, they're still a little hard pressed in terms of accepting it. So that has not happened yet. The closest I've gotten to that type of experience is Yom Kippur. In other words, going to, I myself have not, but certainly having people go for Yom Kippurim to run the tefillah, to run prayer groups, discussions of those tefillot. And it is my hope and aspiration that one day we'll be able to break that barrier and at least offer like just a glimpse into that type of world.
Yeah, even though Yom Kippur is basically a great Shabbaton, that's what it's called, it lacks the whole Shabbos meal thing. So yeah, it'd be kind of hard to do that. I have to credit my wife with asking about this, because she's thinking over here that, oh, that'd be a great idea. Totally on for something like that. Wanted to see something like that, but I guess okay, it'll be a dream. Rabbi Hammer is also involved in a crusade to raise awareness and sensitivity to mental health issues. This year is dedicated to the memory of his daughter Gila, whose tragic passing we just marked a year ago. And now there's what we can actually learn from this week's Parsha and what we could learn from each other. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably connect both. You mentioned the Parsha, but basically, tragically and catastrophically, a little over a year ago, a year and about almost 3.5 weeks ago, our dear daughter Gila, at the young age of 18, died by suicide. And obviously, it has completely shaken the foundation of our family to the core. Certainly, trying to deal with her struggles, her difficulties. Gila herself found herself really in a very difficult place, at least for about a year and a half. Anxieties, depression, difficulty with understanding what her purpose and goal orient should be and was. And I can't go obviously into everything, but number one is that, I decided basically after about 3 days after Shiva that I would try to use whatever strength I could muster, which is not much, and whatever talent I have, which is also not that much, but to be able to use those things to spread a gospel, if you may, regarding people who are suffering from mental challenges and also suicide prevention. There are many times, most of the time, very obvious, blatant signs of people who are contemplating attempting a suicide, and it's extremely important that we be aware of them. Something which my wife and I were not made aware of properly in Gila's case, and I can't go into every detail, but I decided that I would kind of go on a crusade to try and improve the situation here in Eretz Yisrael, throughout the world, halavai, but in Israel, the state of mental health awareness and mental health care is about 20 years behind the most advanced countries in the world, and it's a very serious problem here. Something that we don't need to look further than every single week. We seem to be confronted with people who, Rahman al leave us and depart this world through this type of demise. And so I decided that I have to go out and correct this or help this as much as possible. And I developed 3 lectures, 3 presentations that I offer. One is called Gila's Way, which deals with mental health awareness and suicide prevention. The second is called There Are No Words, which deals with how to confront or approach or speak or not to speak to grieving families, to families who are going through bereavement, which Nebuch, we know that is obviously prevalent in our society here in Israel in different ways. And thirdly, Truths My Daughter Taught Me, which is inspirational insights on Ben Adam L'Chavero, how we should treat one another, how we should be sensitize ourselves to our surroundings and to the people around us who may be suffering, particularly prevalent and relevant to now, to COVID-19. So many people who are experiencing loneliness, isolation, and depression, really, as a result, and how I have learned through Gila and the way she was in her life, because she really was, just for an 18-year-old to lose her life, but in those 18 years, even after her death, she has taught us and demonstrated and continues to demonstrate to us what it means to have and to infuse chesed into your life towards others and to be that example. And that really connects also to the Parshat Shavua, where it's very interesting. The Parsha itself is called Vayechi Yaakov, when in actuality, the Parsha has anything else to do with Chayim, with Chayut, with life. It has to do everything with death. Yaakov Avinu is departing from this world. He's saying goodbye and bidding adieu to his sons. Yosef dies in the Parsha. The brothers themselves see their demise in the Parsha. They are no longer physically. And the question is, why then does it open with Vayechi Yaakov? Why did Chazal decide to ascribe this Parsha with the title of Vayechi? And I think the answer is just that. I think from a Jewish perspective, life doesn't end when physicality is no longer. The physical entities might no longer be with us, but life continues. One of the questions that people consistently ask me when they have the guts to do so is, how on earth do you continue to live? The death of a child, the tragic death of a child at such a young age, is unbearable. And there are times, many, many times, sometimes every day, when I ask myself that question as well. And the answer is twofold. Number one, I always tell people we have, Baruch Hashem, 7 children, 5 children, to a daughter-in-law, son-in-law, 3 grandchildren, and they very much want an Abba and an Ima and a Saba and a Safta who are alive. They want to live, and we have an obligation to them. And then the second answer is really relating to this week's Parsha. It's called Vayechi because the Gemara in Brachot says, Tzadikim afilu b'mitatan nikraim chayim. People who die, so to speak, from a Jewish perspective, continue to live based on their resonance, based on what they resonate, based on the lessons, the values, the morals, the ethics that we can continue to incorporate in our lives from them as they continue to be our teachers. And therefore, they very much remain alive. Their spirit is milaveh, escorts us on a consistent basis. And I can tell you, I can't go into all the stories, but I can tell you that I have multitudes of stories since Gila's death in which it is almost basically blatantly obvious that she is escorting me and us and many other people through their lives vis-a-vis her spirit. So while I long to touch and to hold and to hug and to caress her, something that obviously is never going to happen, nonetheless, from a different perspective, she is Vayechi. Yaakov's spirit continues to walk with us. I saw an interesting interpretation with regards to Moshe Rabbeinu, where it says Vayelech Moshe. So Rashi comments on Vayelech Moshe prior to his death. All he writes is Vayelech Moshe. He repeats the Dibur HaMatchil. He repeats the same heading. What exactly is Rashi teaching us? What are we to learn from him doing so without any insightful commentary? And Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal explains that that's exactly what Rashi is telling us. There are some people who we come in contact with who continue to walk amongst us, even when they are no longer physically there. Is Moshe Rabbeinu dead? Certainly not. His spirit and his lessons and the Torah that he handed to us, vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is very much alive with us every single day. You, Rabbi Grossman, helped me edit my book on Rabbi Yonatan Eibeshitz, Darash Yehonatan. And I often say that Rabbi Yonatan Eibeshitz, the great scholar of the 18th century, is one of my rabbanim, one of my rabbis. Can it be? How is it possible? Rav Soloveitchik explained, based on the Pri Megadim in the Shulchan Aruch, that you can have a Rabbi Muvhak, your premier celebrated Rav, your teacher, can be a sefer that you read. You can feel a kinship, an affinity with that person through what they wrote. And that is why I can call Rabbi Yonatan Eibeshitz one of my rabbanim. He's no longer with us. I never met him, but I met him through his teachings and his writings. And my hope is that through my lectures, my talks, my presentations, that people will meet Gila. They'll know Gila. They'll appreciate who she was. And in that sense, she remains very much alive. Vayechi Yaakov, her chayut, continues to walk with us.
Sorry about that. There's someone honking outside. I think also, this theme about the tzaddik, or the Torah scholar whose legacy continues, it's as though they're not dead. Originally, I saw among people who were in the Batei Midrash where I was, they consider the Rambam, Maimonides, as their continually living Rebbe. It's as though he's in the Beit Midrash with them. Rabbi Soloveitchik even has a classic speech that he gave where Rab Chaim was always with him and Rambam's always with him. And then I came here and I discovered people behave like that with Rabbi Nachman and the Ari. You'd be surprised. I think it's their closeness and their living with their ideological forebears is actually much stronger than it is in, let's say, the Litvish yeshiva world. It's actually quite surprising, and we have what to learn from that. I've also seen, you could probably tell me about this. I realized from our conversation last week, Rabbi Solomon was with us last week, Yaakov Avinu actually is very fearful. It first says that Yaakov fears for what's going to be with Yosef, and then he basically goes into 20 years of depression. That's how Chazal understood it. The fact that Yosef is no longer, he can't even have a funeral for his son, and he's
they could not comfort him.
Yeah, and psychologically, it's because there was no closure there. And then it says that he's deathly afraid. Yehuda describes that his father will die of grief if Binyamin doesn't show up. Yaakov Avinu says to Yosef, finally he's alive. Amutha apam, I can now die just seeing you. He tells Pharaoh right afterwards, I have had such a terribly short life. Yes, and how can he say it like that? He's 130 years old. To everybody else, he's remarkable for his age. And here he says, no, I didn't get to live as long as my own father, or as my fathers, Avram and Yitzchak. And then we see Yaakov at the end of the Parsha is fearful that he will be stuck in Mitzrayim, even in death, and he has to get his most politically powerful son, just swear to me that, or promise me, that you will bury me back home. And then he's worried about what's going to be with his sons. Chazal say that up until the last moment, he had trepidation, just like Reuven is superseded by other brothers in certain respects. His Bechorah is divided into three, according to Targum Onkelos and a pasuk in Divrei Yomim. He loses the leadership and the double inheritance and the kahuna to three different brothers. And then he does almost like that to Yosef. Yosef is so disturbed by how he's putting the hands on the two sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Yosef, I can understand why he sees what his dad's doing and is worried. Dad, what are you doing? That which you just did to Reuven, giving me his birthright and telling me I'm going to get double portion in the land. Are you doing to Menashe now? Is that what's going to happen? He has to comfort him. And only at the very end when it says that they all said Shema Yisrael, and Yaakov responded, Baruch Shem V'hu Malchutho, was he certain, yes, all my sons are kosher, mitato shlema. But how could it be that someone as great as Yaakov Avinu only had that confidence at the very end?
Well,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Please answer.
Well, I'll try to answer. Look, I want you to understand something. In order to, from my perspective, as it's not mine, it's based on commentaries like the Rashar Hirsch. Okay, you go back to the chinuch, so to speak, that was given to Yaakov by his predecessor, by his father, by the patriarch Yitzchak. The chinuch that was given from Avram to Yitzchak. To be honest, their ability to relate to one another and their ability to relate to their children was very hard-pressed. They weren't necessarily great parents. Now, I'm not blaming them, and I'm not coming down on our avot v'imahot. They were the prototypes. They were the, so to speak, the ones who were experimenting. We had the privilege of learning from them, not only from what they did, but from the mistakes that they made. Yitzchak favored one of his children. Rivka favored one of his children. Avram had to favor one of his children. And so that becomes ingrained inside of you, that type of chinuch. Yaakov favored Yosef. It's only afterwards, and I wanted to bring this down in this week's Parsha, I think that what really, ultimately, what makes Yaakov comfortable, if you may, as you're asking, where did he come? Why was he? He was so uncomfortable because what was taught and how he was reared was essentially wrong. Eventually, at the very beginning, at the onset, he tries to sends Yosef and he says, Re'ena shlom achecha, go make peace with your brothers, unite with them. And perhaps Yaakov is still dreaming, in a sense, not realizing that the brothers are not going to find unity until there is recognition that every single one is an individual. Everyone has their own talents. Everyone has their own faults. Everyone makes their own mistakes. And the real realization, the real revelation, I should say, in this week's Parsha is the life that Yaakov recognizes afterwards when he takes the brothers and brings them around his mitah. It's not just, it's reciting Shema Yisrael, Shem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad together. That's how they unify. But let us recognize that Yaakov does not give one united bracha to all of them. No, he takes every single one and he ascribes a specific attribute, characteristic, and bracha that is appropriate to their personality. It is here that Yaakov realizes that even within a cloud, within a nation, there is individualism, there's individuality, and everyone has something to bring to the table. It's only after that realization that they then can proclaim Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Echad Echad. We can unite in our belief in God. Why? Because you have this, I have this person over there has this to offer, and that's really the learning lesson, in my opinion, the greatest lesson of this week's Parsha. It relates also to what I was discussing about mental health awareness. And I want to give a shout out to my friend Stuart Katz, who's bringing and has brought mental health first aid to Israel, which is a tremendous program. But what we have to recognize is that people grow or become mentally challenged many times, not all the time, but many times people become mentally challenged when they become or feel that they are valueless, when they don't feel that they have something to contribute, to bring to the table, when they don't feel that there is a goal, an aspiration, a value that they can ascribe to and that they can offer to the people around them. That makes a person feel useless. That makes a person feel like they're not worth anything. Their self-worth goes down, and that itself can be a cause of a mental illness that would put anybody into depression or make them anxious. One of the greatest problems we had with Gila when she was released from the hospital at one point was she was released from the hospital without a framework. And that was a terrible, terrible error. And we were following the so-called professionals, but they didn't give us direction in terms of, okay, what should she do now? How can she build her character? How can she feel good about herself? At 18 years old, all of her friends were moving on to the army or national service or yeshivot or midrashot and going to learn or pre-military academies. And she was kind of left behind. And she kind of was asking herself, what's in it for me? What do I have to offer others? Because that was what was important to her. She was a very giving person, but she wasn't sure and convinced at some point that she could or had something to give. Yaakov Avinu reminds his sons that regardless of all of your differences, every single one of you have something to give, have something to offer. That is ultimately what gives and maintains health. And I think this is revealed also, by the way, in the Haftarah of this week's Parsha. I always say, to me, it's one of the most amazing, outstanding psukim, where also David HaMelech is Vayikrevu Yemei David Lamut. He's on his deathbed, and he calls Shlomo. Granted, a lot easier to deal with one son than with 12 of them. But having said that, what does he say to Shlomo? He says, Anochi haolech bederech kol haaretz v'chazakta v'hayita la'ish. It's an unbelievable pasuk, because what David does here is he tells Shlomo, who writes Kohelet and Shir HaShirim, the great Shlomo at the age of 12 is proclaiming, Hevel avalim amar Kohelet hakol avel. Everything is worthless. Everything is not. We don't need any of the physicalities and the comforts of this world. Well, David says to him, Anochi olech b'derech kol haaretz. In the end of the day, I am human, like any other person, and I am dying and going to die just like any other person. And he tells him one thing: V'chazakta v'hayita la'ish. Be strong and be a man. And the question is, come on, could he not say to him, be a tzaddik, be a Talmid Chacham, be an outstanding? And the answer is no. Everything begins with first being a decent human being. If you know how to be a man, if you know how to be kind and sensitive and compassionate, and remind yourself that you're human, then you can move on to other levels. And that's a very, very important thing for us to recognize. It is only at the end of Sefer Bereshit that Yaakov Avinu, I believe, recognizes that and gives it over to his children and to the legacy of Am Yisrael.
Wow, that's kind of that's profound, and actually has reminded me of more things, which I'm going to have to ask you about. But we're running out of time, so I have to replug and also say some other more words of gratitude. A special lesson from Rabbi Hammer that he didn't say today, but one that I learned years before. Look at rabbihammer.com and makomishutaf.com. Don't forget to check those out. We'll put those in the description on the YouTube video. Some 20 years ago, I learned something I think everybody else can learn when I was privileged to stay with Rabbi Hammer on a Shabbat. I think it was in November 2000, if I'm not mistaken. I could double check that because I have it written down somewhere at my parents' house. So Rabbi Hammer showed me something that I try to do, and something I think everybody should do. Take time on your Shabbat afternoon. Don't sleep, because that's the best time to study. Your kids are around. Give every single child a chance to sit with you and study some Torah. Every child, according Chanoch Lanar, every child on his own level, what the child can handle. If you have a 6-year-old, teach him to read Aleph Bet, and if you have a 14-year-old girl, she definitely should be finishing Tanakh and having a good grasp of those, perhaps even some basic halachas of the Rambam, so that she knows why it is that she's keeping mitzvot. And from everything in between there, you could do something. If you have a 17-year-old son, make sure you're studying Talmud with him, and make sure to give them a pras. That's a prize. See, pras and prize are the same word. Make sure that you reward your children when you do that. Give each one of your kids the attention. And I'm glad I learned that from Rabbi Hammer, and I hope to try to live up to those standards. So everybody, it's a little bit early to wish.
Just want to say, Rav Ram,
yeah,
that's very kind of you. I will tell you that if that was the only thing that you ever learned from me, Dayenu, it was worth it. But I will say that that's not. I'm not saying this is my credit, but you were a very serious, intelligent, and astute student. It was a pleasure to teach you and to learn from you at the same time. But I thank you for pointing that out to me. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
I pointed this one out because this was sort of a passive lesson. I wasn't told to do this. I just got to observe it, and I figured it has to do with this week's Parsha, giving the children their specific attention. In the yeshiva, the problem is that, well, I don't think this is a problem, but the lecture in, let's say, Talmud or Nosim Ba'alacha, which is topics in halacha, that's given to a group of students, and it's not necessarily tailored to the specifics. So I like to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, a continuation of this year. It should, Tafshin Pei Aleph, it should only be for blessing. For all of Am Yisrael, we should see the end of whatever plague it is that's been affecting us. All health issues should be resolved. We should have a stable government here in the land of Israel. We should wish our brethren in the diaspora also much health and happiness and safety. And thank you all for tuning in. Be well. Thank you, Rabbi Hammer, for joining us.
Thank you.
See you next time.